Bumpy Johnson knew he was dying. The chest pains had been getting worse for weeks. July 6, 1968. He woke up that morning, knowing it might be his last day. But he went to Wells' restaurant anyway. Same table, same breakfast. Because the Genovese family had sent word, they wanted a meeting about heroin, about Harlem's future, about what happens when the king dies. Bumpy could have stayed home, spent his last hours in peace. Instead, he sat across from 3 mob enforcers and made a choice: protect his legacy or protect his life. He couldn't do both. He chose Harlem. If you walked through Harlem in the summer of 1968, you'd see something dying. Not the buildings, not the music, not the people, but the soul. Heroin was creeping into the streets like poison gas, and everyone knew where it was coming from. The Italian mob. Specifically, the Genovese crime family. For 30 years, Bumpy Johnson had kept that poison out. He ran the numbers, controlled gambling, maintained the fragile peace between the Irish, the Italians, and his own people. And he had one rule that never bent: no heroin in Harlem. Not in his neighborhood. Not while he was breathing. But in 1968, Bumpy wasn't breathing well anymore. He was 62. His heart was failing. Doctors at Harlem Hospital had warned him 6 months earlier. Slow down. Retire. Enjoy what time you have left. Bumpy had laughed. Retire? A man like me doesn't retire, he said. He died working, and if he was going to die, it would be on his feet, not in a hospital bed. The Genoveses knew this. They had been watching, waiting. Vito Genovese himself was locked in federal prison in Atlanta, dying of a heart condition, just like Bumpy, but his family was still powerful, still hungry. They saw an opportunity. Harlem without Bumpy Johnson was an open market, a gold mine waiting to be claimed. The young soldiers, the ones who didn't remember Bumpy, walking into Lucky Luciano's office unarmed in 1935 and walking out alive, thought it would be easy. Wait for the old man to die, then move in. Set up heroin distribution networks, take over the numbers racket, turn Harlem into another profit center. But the older bosses, the ones who remembered, knew better. They knew Bumpy Johnson was more dangerous dying than most men were in their prime. They knew you didn't just walk into Harlem and take what you wanted, not while Bumpy was alive. So they tried negotiation first. Make him an offer. Appeal to his business sense. After all, he was old, sick, dying. Surely he'd want to secure his family's future. Surely he'd want one last payday. On July 6, 1968, 3 men in expensive suits got into a black Cadillac in Little Italy and drove uptown to Harlem. Anthony Tony Peels, Lentini, Joseph Joey Surprise, Stacy, and a young soldier named Paulie Fortunato. They were armed. They were connected. Joey Surprise carried a black leather briefcase containing $100,000 in cash. They had no idea they were driving straight into their own humiliation. Wells' restaurant sat on the corner of 132nd Street and 7th Avenue. It wasn't fancy. Red leather booths, worn smooth by decades of use. Black and white checkered floors. The smell of bacon grease and coffee drifting from the kitchen. Photographs of Harlem legends, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. lined the walls. In the corner, a framed photo of Bumpy Johnson himself, shaking hands with Muhammad Ali. But this was Bumpy's place. His table, always, in the back corner, faced the door. Old habit from the days when enemies didn't come with contracts. They came with guns. That morning, Bumpy was alone. His wife, Mame, had begged him not to go. She had felt it in the air, the way women who've lived with dangerous men learn to sense danger before it arrives. But Bumpy kissed her forehead, straightened his tie, and said he'd be home by noon. He always wore a suit, even for breakfast. "Respect," he said. "Respect yourself. Respect others." He ordered his usual: scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, wheat toast, black coffee. He read the Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper, an article about the garbage workers' strike when the restaurant door opened and the three men walked in. The entire restaurant went quiet. Not the sudden silence of shock, but the gradual dimming of conversation as people recognized the moment. The waitress Dorothy, who'd worked at Wells for 20 years, froze mid-pour. Her hand trembled, coffee spilling onto the counter. Everyone in Harlem knew what Italian suits in a black neighborhood meant. Business the kind that usually ended badly for someone. Bumpy didn't look up from his paper. He sipped his coffee slowly, turned the page deliberately, and waited. He'd been expecting this. Word travels fast in both worlds, and he'd known. The Genovese family was planning a move. He'd known they'd send someone eventually. He just hadn't known it would be today. Not Tony Peels, the talker, the negotiator, a capo in his mid-40s, who'd made his bones running bookmaking operations in the Bronx, was the first to approach. Joey Surprise stayed by the door, blocking it, eyes scanning the restaurant for threats. The black leather briefcase hung heavy in his hand. Paulie, the youngest of the group, barely 25, hovered behind Tony, trying to look hard, trying to look like he belonged in the same room as Bumpy Johnson. "Mr. Johnson," Tony said, voice respectful but firm. "Mind if we sit?" Bumpy folded his newspaper slowly, deliberately, taking his time. He looked up at Tony with those cold, calculating eyes, the same eyes that had stared down mob bosses, crooked cops, and killers for 30 years. Eyes that had seen men die and never flinched, and he gestured to the booth across from him. "Free country." The three men slid in. Dorothy, the waitress, hands trembling slightly, asked if they wanted coffee. Tony waved her off without looking. This wasn't a social call, it was business. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the sizzle of bacon on the griddle, the hum of whispered conversations from other tables, and the tick of the old Coca-Cola clock on the wall. Everyone in the restaurant watched, pretending not to watch. Across the street, in a parked Buick, two of Bumpy's men, Big Jack Turner and Raymond Slim Washington, observed the scene through the window. Bumpy never went anywhere without backup. Not in 1968. Not with the streets growing dangerous, with young punks getting bold, with the old rules breaking down. Tony Peels broke the silence. He nodded to Joey, who stepped forward, placing the black leather briefcase on the table between Bumpy and Tony, right next to Bumpy's coffee cup. The kind of briefcase bankers carried. The kind serious money traveled in. Metallic latches clicked open too loud in the quiet room. Inside, bundles of $100 bills, stacked neatly, bank-strapped. Real money, visible, tempting. Double quotes, Mr. Johnson. Tony said, lowering his voice to that confidential, salesman-like tone. "We come with respect. With a business proposition I think you'll find very generous." Bumpy didn't touch the briefcase, didn't even glance inside. His eyes never left Tony's face. "I'm listening." Tony leaned forward, hands folded neatly on the table. "The world is changing, Mr. Johnson. You know this better than anyone. The young people, they don't want numbers anymore. They don't want policy slips or betting pools. They want something stronger, something that makes them forget Vietnam. Forget poverty, forget everything. They want heroin." Bumpy's expression didn't change. He took another sip of coffee. His hands were steady. Tony gestured to the open briefcase. "Whether you like it or not, it's coming to Harlem. The supply routes are established. Marseille, Turkey, Southeast Asia. Product will flow. The only question is who controls it." He tapped the stacks of bills. $100,000 in cash. Tax-free, untraceable. Just the down payment. We're offering you 30% of all profits in Harlem. You don't have to distribute. Don't have to take any risk. Just stop blocking us. You keep your territory. We keep ours. Everybody eats. The money gleamed in neat stacks, bank straps holding it tight. A fortune. Enough to secure a family, buy property, leave a legacy beyond the streets. Enough to die comfortably. But Bumpy Johnson never cared about dying comfortable. Polly, young and reckless, couldn't keep quiet. Mr. Johnson, with all due respect, you're not a young man anymore. 30 years at the top, more than most men ever get. Why fight this? Take the money. Live to see your grandchildren grow up. We're showing respect to a legend. Bumpy's eyes shifted from Tony to Polly. The temperature in the booth dropped 10 degrees. Dorothy, refilling water glasses 3 tables away, felt it. The other patrons felt it. Even Tony felt it. 2. Late? How old are you, son? Bumpy's voice was quiet, conversational. 25, Polly muttered, trying to look tough, trying to hide the knot forming in his stomach. Bumpy nodded slowly, as if weighing something far larger than this moment. You know how old I was when I walked into Lucky, Luciano's office in Manhattan, and told him he couldn't touch Harlem without my permission? Polly didn't answer. Didn't know. 29. 4 years older than you. You know what Lucky told me? He said I was crazy, dead man walking, that his organization would crush me like a bug. That was 1935. 33 years ago. And here I am, still breathing, still in Harlem. And Lucky? He died in Italy in exile, 1962. Heart attack. Just like the one that's going to kill me. Bumpy's eyes returned to Tony. Where's Vito Genovese right now? Tony shifted uncomfortably. He's in federal prison, Mr. Johnson. Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Heart disease, same as you. Bumpy smiled, but there was no warmth. Funny how that works. We spend our whole lives fighting each other, and in the end, it's our own hearts that kill us. Tony tried to regain control. Mr. Johnson, nobody's disrespecting you. We know your history. We know what you've built. But times change. The old ways, the old codes, the old ways? Bumpy's voice cut like a straight razor. You think you're offering me something new? Think I haven't seen this before? Heroin isn't new, Tony. It's been knocking on Harlem's door since the 1920s, after World War I, then after World War II. Every single time I slammed that door shut. You know why? Bumpy's voice was low, calm, but every word carried the weight of decades. Tony didn't answer, because I've seen what it does. I watched it destroy Chinatown in the 30s, hollow out neighborhoods in Chicago, turn human beings into walking corpses. And I made a promise to this community that as long as I was breathing, that poison wouldn't flow freely through Harlem. He reached across the table and snapped the briefcase shut. The metallic latches clicked with finality. Then he pushed it back toward Tony, sliding it across the table. The scraping sound echoed in the silent restaurant. I don't want your money, and I don't want your poison in my neighborhood. Joey Surprise, standing by the door, spoke up, voice harder than Tony's. Bumpy, be reasonable. You can't stop this. You're one man. We're an organization. Muscle, connections, politicians on payroll. What do you have? A few old numbers runners, and a reputation. Bumpy looked at Joey, then Tony, then young Polly. And for the first time since they'd sat down, he smiled. Not warm, not friendly. This was the smile of a man who had stared death in the face and made peace with it. Let me tell you something about Harlem, he said, voice steady, strong, even as the tightness began building in his chest. You think it's just another Neighborhood, another market to exploit, another revenue stream? He shook his head slowly. Harlem is a promise. A promise to the people who built it with their bare hands. A promise to the people who came up from the South looking for freedom and found it here. A promise to the kids growing up in these streets that there's another way besides crime, besides drugs, besides destroying yourself to make white men in downtown offices rich. He pointed at the briefcase. You bring that garbage into Harlem, you're not selling business. You're selling death, hopelessness. You're taking young men who could be doctors, lawyers, teachers, leadersmen who could change the world, and you're turning them into addicts, into corpses. Tony shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Johnson, we're businessmen, not responsible. Don't dress it up with words like business and choice. Bumpy interrupted, voice filling the room without rising. You're murderers. You sell poison. You destroy families. You kill communities. And you want me to shake your hand and help you do it? The pain hit his chest, sharp now, a vice squeezing tighter. His left arm tingled. He recognized the signs just like his father in 1922, clutching his chest in a cotton field in South Carolina. Death was coming for him. But he wasn't done. Here's my answer to your proposition, he said, looking each man in the eye. Tony, Joey, Polly, who couldn't meet his gaze. You can bring your heroin to Harlem, over my dead body. And even then, the people I've taught, the lessons I've lived, they'll fight you every step. You'll never control Harlem, not like Little Italy, not like the Bronx, not while there's one person left who remembers. What I stood for? The pain was sharper now, breathing difficult. But he had one more thing to say. 7 words that would echo in Harlem for 50 years. 7 words that would become his epitaph. He leaned forward, eyes locked on Tony Peel's. Harlem doesn't bow. Not now. Not ever. The sledgehammer hit his chest. His hand flew up, gripping his shirt. Coffee slipped from his other hand, shattering. On the checkered floor, black liquid spread like blood. Somebody call an ambulance. Dorothy screamed behind the counter. Before anyone could move, the restaurant door burst open. 4 men stormed in Harlem, men, loyal to Bumpy. Big Jack. Turner led the way, his 6'4" frame filling the doorway. Behind him, Raymond, Slim Washington, Marcus Deacon Williams, and Cleveland, a young enforcer from Bumpy's policy banks. They'd been watching across the street, seen the Italians walk in, seen Bumpy clutch his chest through the window. Now they ran. Big Jack's eyes went from Bumpy on the floor to the 3 Italians in the booth, and then to the briefcase. What did you do to him? Big Jack's voice was ice, pure murder. Tony Peel's went pale. Hands instinctively came up. Nothing. We were just... He just grabs his chest. I swear, we didn't... You brought poison to his table. Big Jack stepped closer, massive hands flexing into fists. You disrespected him in his own neighborhood. And now he's dying right in front of you. And that was when Tony Peel's understood. So did Joey Surprise. So did young Paulie, whose face had gone from cocky to terrified in about 3 seconds dotted. Didn't matter what actually happened. It didn't matter that Bumpy was 62 years old with a failing heart. What mattered was perception. What mattered was what it looked like. 3 Italian mobsters sitting across from Bumpy Johnson as he had a heart attack in Harlem, with witnesses in a neighborhood that loved him like a father. They'd be torn apart before the ambulance arrived. Joey Surprise was already backing toward the door, the briefcase still in his hand. Paulie's hand drifted toward his jacket, toward his gun, but Big Jack caught his wrist in a grip like a steel trap. You pull that gun, boy, and you'll never leave this neighborhood. None of you will. There'll be 3 bodies floating in the East River by sunset. Through the pain, the vice crushing his chest, the ragged breathing. Bumpy managed to speak. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the terrified silence of Wells' restaurant, everyone heard it. Let them go. Big Jack looked down at him, confused, angry. Boss? Let them go? Bumpy's breathing was ragged, each word a struggle. I want them to tell their bosses, he gasped, eyes locking on Tony Peel's. Tell them, Harlem doesn't bow. Big Jack released Polly's wrist, stepping back to create a path to the door, but his eyes promised violence if they ever returned. Tony Peel snatched the briefcase from the table. Evidence, witness, problem got, and the three Italians didn't walk, they ran. Joey clutching the briefcase. Polly and Tony right behind him. Out the door, into their Cadillac, tires squealing as they burned rubber. They weren't running from Bumpy alone. They were running from the wrath of an entire neighborhood. From the knowledge that if Bumpy Johnson died with them in the room, they'd be blamed, and Harlem would come for them. Every street corner, every alley, every rooftop nowhere would be safe. Behind them, in Wells' restaurant, Dorothy knelt at Bumpy's side, holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. Big Jack was yelling for someone to call the hospital. Customers gathered around, some crying, some praying. Bumpy looked up at Dorothy and managed a soft, real smile. Tell my, he whispered. Tell her I'm sorry I missed lunch. Those were his last words. At 8:52 a.m., July 7th, 1968. Bumpy Johnson's heart gave out. 5 minutes after the meeting with the Genovese family representatives. 5 minutes after he said no to $100,000. 5 minutes after he chose principle over survival. He died sitting in his booth at Wells' restaurant, the same place he'd eaten breakfast every Saturday morning for 20 years. Surrounded by people who knew him, respected him, loved him. He died free, unbought, unbowed. The funeral, 5 days later at Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street, drew over 5,000 people. The line stretched 6 blocks down 7th Avenue. People who'd never met Bumpy. People who'd only heard stories. People whose parents told them of the man who kept Harlem safe. They all came to say goodbye. The Italian mob tried to move in afterward. For 6 months, they pushed heroin into Harlem, thinking the king was dead and the throne empty. They were wrong. The old guard, the numbers runners who'd worked with Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy since the 1930s. The local operators who remembered. The codes, the street-level organizers who learned from watching Bumpy navigate between legitimacy and the underworld. They remembered what Bumpy stood for. They remembered his words, Harlem doesn't bow. But history is painful. Nature abhors a vacuum. Within a few years, younger hustlers who hadn't learned Bumpy's rules did start bringing heroin in larger quantities. They told themselves they could control it, that they could profit without destroying the neighborhood. They were wrong. The heroin epidemic Bumpy fought so hard to prevent came anyway. Families were destroyed. Young men and women became addicts. But the truth is this, it was harder because of Bumpy. The Italian mob never fully controlled Harlem the way they controlled Little Italy, the Bronx, or parts of Brooklyn. Local operators retained autonomy. The community remembered there was another way, even if they couldn't always live it. When the crack epidemic hit in the 1980s, there were still those who remembered Bumpy Johnson's stand. They invoked his name. They reminded the young people, once we had a man who said no. Once we had a king who chose principle over profit. Once we had a leader who'd rather die than betray his community. That memory mattered. It still matters. Tony Peels kept that black leather briefcase for the rest of his life. Never opened it. Never deposited the money. Never spent a single dollar. Because in Harlem, respect isn't bought. It's earned. And Bumpy Johnson earned it. Until his very last breath. The $100,000 was still inside, exactly as it had been stacked at morning. Same bank straps, same bundles, untouched. Bumpy kept it in a safe in his Queens basement. And occasionally, when young mobsters came to him, for advice, for wisdom, for stories about the old days, he would take out that briefcase, open it, and show them the money. "This," he'd say, pointing to the neat stacks of bills, "is what happens when you disrespect a king. This is what happens when you think money can buy everything." Bumpy Johnson was dying, and he had been offered a fortune. He chose instead to die on his principles. He would close the briefcase, lock it back in the safe, and teach a lesson. In honor, in integrity, in courage. Tony Peels died in 1987 of lung cancer. After his funeral, his son, Anthony Jr., found the briefcase in the basement safe. He opened it. The money was still there, bundled, yellowed with age, intact. Inside was a handwritten note. "Give this to the Schomburg Center in Harlem. It belongs to them, not to us. Let them know it's the money Bumpy Johnson refused. The money that proved he couldn't be bought." TP, allegedly, in 1988, the briefcase and its contents were donated anonymously to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. The museum won't officially confirm it, but curators who have worked there for decades quietly say, somewhere in the archives sits a black leather briefcase with $100,000 in 1968. Bills a memorial to the day a dying man said no. Wells Restaurant closed in 1982, a victim of changing neighborhoods and rising rents. Before the building was torn down for a parking garage, Harlem residents commissioned a small brass plaque. It was installed on the wall where Bumpy's booth had been, but it stayed only one day before the wrecking crew arrived. Someone photographed it, and that photo circulated through Harlem. The words were memorized, repeated, passed down. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 1905 to 1968, the man who never bowed. In this place, he chose honor over life. Walk through Harlem today, and you'll still hear his name. Old-timers on stoops, playing. Dominoes, sipping coffee, they tell stories. How Bumpy faced down Lucky Luciano and walked out alive. How he stopped a riot with a single gesture. How he sat across from the Italian mob and said no with his dying breath. Legends blur with facts. Timelines get confused. Details slip. But the essence remains true. Once, Harlem had a king who could not be bought. Once, a man chose his community over his comfort. Once, someone proved that some things matter more than money, more than power, more than life itself. That was Bumpy Johnson, not his gambling empire, not his violence, not his criminal dealings. No, the moment that defines him is the day he had to choose between surviving a few more months in comfort or dying on his principles. He chose to die standing up. He showed Harlem and the world what real strength looks like, not the strength to hurt, not the strength to amass wealth, but the strength to say no when everyone expects you to say yes. The strength to choose the hard right over the easy wrong. The strength to be a man of principle in a world that rewards compromise. On July 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson's heart stopped, but his words still echo. Harlem doesn't bow. Not now. Not ever. 56 years later, those words still matter. They still inspire. They remind us that we have choices, that we have agency, that we don't have to accept the world as it is. We can be like Bumpy. We can stand up. We can say no. We can choose principle over survival, even if it costs us everything.